Hear and attend and listen, for this befell and behappened and became and was, O my best beloved. When the tame animals were wild, the dog was wild, and the horse was wild, and the cow was wild, and the sheep was wild, and the pig was wild as wild could be. And they walked in the wet wild woods by their wild lones. But the wildest of all the animals was the cat. He walked by himself, and all places were alike to him. This week, we're talking about Just So Stories by Rudyard Kipling. Just so. Welcome to Matt Reviews Books. I am your host, Matt. And this is a book review channel dedicated to older books, some older than others. In this case, over a century old, because this book, Just So Stories, was in fact written in 1902. 115 years later, and this thing is still worth talking about. It's still worth also reading to your children. It was originally called Just So Stories for Children, because the first few stories in the collection were actually told to Kipling's daughter. Kipling told these stories, and he had to tell them just right. He had to tell them just so. Otherwise, his daughter would correct him. Then he wrote them down, and he wrote others, and he collected them. And in fact, they were really largely, nobody else had written children's stories quite this way. And what I mean by this way is returning to a method of storytelling or a structure of storytelling very similar to the oral traditions of passing of stories and myths from one generation to the next. And Kipling utilizes a couple of things that are part of the oral tradition. One is alliteration, the use of repeated syllables or consonants in a row. For example, in one of the stories, it refers to the great gray green greasy Limpopo River. The second one is repetition. There is often a lot of repetition, and if you hear it, you can hear it in that first paragraph of the cat that walks by himself that I started off this video with. There's repetition. They are great examples of human transmission of ideas. It's why we read. It's also just fun. It's easy on the ear, easy on the tongue. It's fun to read, and it's fun to hear. So, with that, let's move on properly to the synopsis. Just so! And their origin stories. They are, for example, how the whale got his throat, how the leopard got his spots, how the elephant got his trunk, also called the elephant's child. Also included in there is the first letter, how the rhino got his skin, and, my personal favorite, the cat that walked by himself, which is a story of how animals became domesticated. For example, the sheep and the dog and the cow. But that the cat doesn't ever quite fit in. The cat still is considered aloof and separate and has a mind of its own. These are not true to science origin stories. They're much more along of the epic myth-making type of story. For example, the whale got his throat because he swallowed a man. And the man upset the whale's throat and was mad at the whale, and took a grating from a ship that he had swallowed, and took his suspenders and used the suspenders and tied the grating of the ship into the throat of the whale and stretched the throat, but it had really small holes, which is why, to this day, whales can only eat very small things. So that's the gist of these stories. So I guess with that, here we go. Thoughts. Obviously, if you haven't figured it out, I'm a big fan of Just So stories. I'm actually a fan of Kipling. He writes a good story. This is a good example of his facility to use pretty sophisticated techniques in a simple way. It's really powerful, and you don't really think about it. You can write them off as, oh, they're nice, they're children's stories. I think if you haven't read Kipling, it's worthwhile. His language is actually pretty light. This guy definitely belongs on everybody's bookshelf. I got a hangnail. But I will see you next time!